SOPA and PIPA last year, and for those of you who don't know, SOPA and PIPA were intellectual property bills that would have, for the very first time, put liability on the owners of websites for anything that people posted on those websites. It would have really changed the internet as we know it in very bad ways. And it was turned back by a massive grassroots movement. And it was kind of a coming of age story for the digital generation, in the sense that for the first time, people collectively came together and said that the internet is something that it's ours, and we have the capacity we have a mandate to defend it and make sure that it continues to be a dynamic force for good and the things that we care about. So today we're going to talk about how to craft a proactive internet agenda. But before we look forward, let's look backward for a quick second. And my question, I'll start with Jamie, but everybody please chip in, is are SOPA and PIPA, even after last year, are they dead? Or are they going to come back in a newer, different, perhaps more difficult guise?
It's a good question. I think SOPA and PIPA, as we know them, are dead. I think the fear is that the proponents of the legislation will try a different means to achieve what they seek, which is they may seek to ensure that international commitments the U.S. agrees to requires us to pass domestic laws that are more in line with SOPA and PIPA than with the architecture, the policy architecture we have today. And so that's a real danger.
And we've also seen, in addition to that, some private partnerships, for instance, between internet service providers and rights holders trying to, it's almost like SOPA and PIPA light. They're trying to use private agreements to get at what they claim are rampant infringement. And of course, you can't stop them legislatively from doing that. I guess maybe you could, but you really can't because it's a private contract. But what you run into, again, is, and we'll talk about this more later, this kind of lack of transparency, people sitting in a back room making up these deals without bringing in the user. So that's also another front of this fight.
Yeah, and that was one of the concerns, Jamie and I, dealing with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which is an international agreement that's being negotiated right now amongst 9 different countries. And the intellectual property components of it have been very controversial, in part because no one really knows what's in it exactly unless you have a secret clearance or you sign a non-disclosure agreement. So this, is another platform and mechanism that can end up affecting us all in regards to how we access information, how we get access to content and products, but we don't really know what's happening there. But at some point, the administration is going to basically go to Congress and say, hey, we want trade promotion authority so we can implement this agreement that we've negotiated without telling you guys about it.
But I think the short answer to your question, Michael, is at least in the next Congress, and I'm the only one who's not from DC, so correct me if I'm wrong, but at least in the next Congress, I don't think we're going to see any proposed legislation that would be, the son of SOPA, as we've called it, like a straight up intellectual property bill. We will see intellectual property bills, but not copyright bills of that ilk, at least this Congress.
The internet has proved that it can stop something, even when it comes to overcoming very strong entrenched interests. Can organized netizens prevail over entrenched interests to actually make something positive happen? And then the corollary is, what would that positive agenda be? And where do we begin?
The short answer is yes. Of course, the internet is this fantastic platform. You guys probably came to this session because you saw it online and you're like, oh, I want to find out more about, how to move on beyond SOPA, PIPA and to create these movements. And in general, it's this connected body that just enables so many things. When it comes to creating, I think, sustainable movements, and in particular affecting government, there are a couple of parts to it. One, all of us have to be able to continue to use the platform, which was threatened via SOPA, PIPA, to remain active and to communicate with each other when there are things that we either support or things that we're threatened by that are out there, to let our friends know, to let the public know, to really engage, basically. It's the lack of engagement that is the biggest threat, I think, to our society in general. I think the other part of it is we need to encourage government to be more open. that was one of the problems that came out of the process of the development of SOPA and PIPA, is that we didn't know what was going on. They were just thrown out there. And just in general, there's this almost fear these days, it seems like, to act for government transparency. And I think that that's really important, because if we're going to be a government, of the people, by the people, for the people, then we have to know, the government needs to let us know what's going on. And I think that the internet as a platform is how we enable that, and also through all of us continuing to communicate.
Yeah, I think, as a practical matter, it's harder to push through positive agenda than it is to stop, positive legislation than it is to stop legislation. It's hard to make law than it is to stop bad bills you don't like. That doesn't mean it's not doable or we can't do it. It's just a little bit tougher. I know too that there's a lot of concern about not taking advantage, like not trying to send millions of emails for every issue that comes up, because you don't want to, you want to wait for the things that are really important. And I think, it's still early in this kind of movement, so we're still kind of navigating that, figuring out. But the truth of the matter is, I can't navigate it. No one up here can make that happen. If the people out there want to start emailing Congress, or if someone wants to create a tool that makes it easy to email your members of Congress or call your members of Congress, you don't need anyone's permission. And that's what's so exciting about this. But I do think, we need to be responsible as a society to make sure that we're using the power of communication appropriately and the power of information responsibly.
I would just say the interesting thing about what happened last year is it was really the insurgents that beat the incumbents. The incumbents are the Motion Picture Association, the recording industry, their lobbyists, who've always had their way in Washington. And what happened is they lost, and they lost by two people they didn't expect to lose from. And so what I think this means is that rather than the status quo where policymakers and lobbyists and think tanks in Washington establish what the agenda is and then try to drive it forward, increasingly policymakers and people in Washington are going to have to facilitate an agenda that is determined and moved by citizens empowered by technology and the internet.